as the Bible teaches us, is the rock of our salvation. On the day that he decided to stand on a rocky environment and share the Sermon on the Mount, he presented some of the most important truths of the Christian life. He spoke of giving, of lust, of divorce. He talked about worship and prayer and serving others. Jesus wants us to make this world and build our lives, make his words and build our lives upon them, building on the rock, the foundation of our salvation. Jesus, in this Sermon on the Mount, began to speak to those on the mountainside about righteous living versus the hypocrisy that they had seen with the Pharisees of their day. Matthew chapter 5 falls into three categories, each answering a question. In verses 3 through 12 of Matthew chapter 5, Jesus asks and answers the question, what does it mean to have character? In verses 13 through 16, he asks and answers the question, what does it mean to make an impact? And then in verses 17 through 48, he asks and answers the question, what does it mean to be godly? In the text this morning, in chapter 5, in verse 13 through 16, Jesus uses two domestic metaphors to show how Christians impact the world. But before we can understand these warnings and images, we must understand two things about the world in which we are living. First, the world that we live in is in a process of decay. It is constantly getting worse. Paul writes in Philippians chapter 2, verse 14 and 15, do all things without grumbling or disputing, so that you will improve yourselves to be blameless and innocent, children of God, above reproach in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation, among whom you appear as lights in the world. This world is also enveloped in spiritual darkness. The depth of this darkness can be scarcely exaggerated. Those who sit in darkness not only are blind, but they are recoiled at the very showing of light. With this in mind, understand the metaphors that Jesus said that we're to be. We're to be light and we're to be salt. We're to be the salt of the earth because salt can preserve and protect the world from decay. When it is shaken out of the salt shaker, it can season a tasteless world. He then says that we're to be the light of the world. To overcome its darkness, this world's order, the light must shine. We are Christians, we as Christians should be shaking and shining at the same time. Shaking out salt and shining with the light. We today will deal primarily with the salt. Christians are the salt of the earth. Christ calls us to live salty lives so that we can make a difference in this world. We have to be careful that we are not salt that's lost its savor, good for nothing but to be thrown and trodden on and walked on by man. Salt is necessary for life. We all know that. You might have had some salt during your breakfast this morning. Table salt is actually sodium chloride, which many of you played around with in chemistry class years ago. In my case, a long time ago. We can get hydrogen by dropping sodium in the water, and we can get poisonous gas from chloride. These are two dangerous elements. If you are to ingest either of itself, then that might cause us some problems. But God, in his chemistry, has put them together to make something necessary for life. In the same way, God took the deadly part of us and through the chemistry of the cross of Christ made something new and alive. We used to be dead in trespasses and sin, but now we are alive. We've been quickened by Jesus Christ. In the text, we find Jesus teaching us on this Sermon on the Mount. He's sitting teaching his subjects about the kingdom of heaven. Now in his teaching, he wants to make 5 salient points that we want to share this morning in the subject. Pass the salt, please. First of all, we want to talk about the salt seasons. Secondly, salt preserves. Third, salt heals. Fourth, salt irritates. And then fifth, salt penetrates. Pass the salt, please. Did you ever wonder why Jesus used this metaphor in his Sermon on the Mount? To grasp its meaning, we must first understand the importance of salt during Jesus' day. Salt was a necessary commodity, but not just necessary. It was almost as valuable as gold. Pure salt was a rare delicacy and often used as a medium of exchange. As a matter of fact, we get the word salary from the word salt. Back in the heyday of the Roman Empire, a portion of the soldier's pay was measured out in salt. The soldier would be very careful to keep the salt dry and in some type of pouch because it would make his army rations more palatable. A soldier kept his packet of salt because this salt was sometimes a payment. It was called a salarium. It is from the old Roman term that we get our word salary. The word salary literally means salt money. And we still have a handy saying of a person that's worth their weight in salt. We need salt to live, but at the time of Christ, salt was essentially valuable in many other reasons as well. Salt seasons. First of all, salt causes flavor to come alive. You ever eaten something and it had no salt at all? Then it tastes bland. But salt has a way of awakening the flavor in food. Job chapter 6 and verse 6. Salt seasons food and makes it palatable. There's no taste in the white of an egg, but a little salt makes it taste good. In the same way, Christians are the salt of the earth. We are the seasoning for society. We are to give a little life, a little zest to the world. There are so many Christians living bland, flavorless lives. No taste, no excitement, no thrill. But we have been called to be different. God, Jesus, the Son of God, called us to be the salt of the world. Paul writes in Colossians chapter 4, verse 6, that we make sure that our speech is always seasoned with salt. Therefore, it should be the flavor. We ought to add flavor when we talk. You know, unfortunately, I've met some people in my lifetime that I hate to hear them talk. Not because their volume or not because of the words necessarily that they say, but because of the fact that they are tasteless, they are flavorless, they bring no life to the conversation. They are just depressed and tasteless, and they bring it out in their conversation. But we as children of God, the Lord expects us to season conversation, to season life, to season the workplace, to season the school, to season where we are, because we are children of God. Pass the salt, please. Secondly, salt preserves. Not only does salt season, but it preserves. When Jesus talked about being the salt of the earth, he was standing or sitting by the Sea of Galilee. The people were understood that salt acts as a preservative. Salt prevents decay. It restrains corruption. It was necessary for fishermen to keep their fish in salt in order to preserve them. If there's ever a day when we need a preserving power, we need the preserving power of the gospel of Christ. It is in this day of our decaying society. We need salt, the flavor of a Christian, to bring life to the world. We should not think like everybody else and act like everybody else and just go along. We are to preserve and to heal. Pass the salt, please. Then thirdly, salt heals. Not only does it season and preserve, but it heals. Salt is like an antiseptic. It has an antiseptic property in it. It aids in the healing process. Elijah once put a measure of salt into some polluted waters and healed them of their bitterness. 2 Kings 2, verse 19 through 22. When babies were born years ago, people used to rub salt on their bodies to prevent infection. According to Ezekiel 16:4, it was a saline solution that was rubbed on them to keep bacteria from getting in the body. Salt heals, and therefore it not only heals, but it preserves. It's healing as the life-giving, healing of the salt of the gospel. When the gospel goes out, it has the healing touch that can cure addictions, mend broken hearts, change lives. The gospel can be an antiseptic for what ails mankind. Salt irritates. Not only does salt season, and salt preserves, and salt heals, but salt also irritates. If you have ever spilled salt into a cut on your body, you know that salt irritates. Mark 9:49 speaks of being salted with fire. So salt and fire share the ability to burn. The truth of God's word, when it is rubbed into the decaying world, it stings. That's why you can't be upset. You know, we're in conversation sometimes and we just kind of want to go along. The conversation of homosexuality comes up and we don't want to condemn anybody. But that's not your job. As the gospel of Christ and perpetrators of the gospel of Christ, we sometimes have to irritate. We have to stir things up. If there's conversation that's happening that are not approved of God, and you, as a child of God, know what God's approved of, if that conversation is not going according to God's will, and you're involved in the conversation, then you may be called on to irritate that conversation with the truth of the gospel of Christ. Pass the salt, please. And then fifth and finally, salt penetrates. Salt not only heals and preserves and seasons and irritates, but it also penetrates. Just a pinch of salt in a gallon of water still will permeate the entire supply. Salt is one of the few major components that dissolves equally in hot or cold water. It penetrates the entire amount. The same way the gospel penetrates our lives. That's why we got to preach the gospel of Christ, brothers and sisters. We got to share it. We can change an entire country with preaching the gospel of Christ. That's why the church ought to be a salt shaker, penetrating the world with its message, rather than being a salt warehouse, stored up tons of salt, just sitting on the shelf. God wants us to be shaken out on the world, to influence the world. Just like he wants us to be light, he wants us to be salt because of the fact that we can influence the world. Brothers and sisters, what do you think our job is? You think our job is just to come to church on Sundays and live half all right lives? No, brothers and sisters, we're to make a difference. We're to make a difference in Carlsbad, New Mexico. Things ought to be better in Carlsbad, not because of the oil, but because of the children of God. The children of God make things better, make things different, help change the landscape of a city or a country because of the influence of the gospel of Christ in us. This morning, have you let the gospel influence you? Have you let the gospel heal you, preserve you, penetrate you, irritate you enough to make a change in your life?